Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
Taking some time out of your day to join me, Robin Koerner, on Liberty with Love, streaming 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern every Saturday and Sunday at libertytalk.fm, and available for download after it streams, usually on the Sunday or the Monday after the episode streams. This is going to be another show where I ponder and postulate and talk. A lot has happened in the last couple of weeks. This is being streamed in the first instance on the 8th of April. And that is 2 days after an important date for me. That important date being the day I became an American citizen. 2 days ago was the first anniversary of my raising the hand at the Department of Homeland Security building in Tequila, Washington State, my home state, to become a citizen of the United States. And I should say, because it's good to be accurate about these things, to become a citizen of Washington State as well, since, as we all know, according to the 10th Amendment that I have up on my wall here in front of me where I'm recording this at home, the states are sovereign. It was an amazing thing to become an American, and it is extraordinary that I have been American for a year. It doesn't feel like it. It really doesn't feel like it. Some of my closer followers may in fact already know that this was the 1 year anniversary of my becoming an American, because they may have seen that I have started putting out little 4 or 5 minute videos on YouTube. I know this is, in this day and age, so important, right? I think I mentioned it actually in my show with Leslie Blanchard, my interview last week. Check that out, by the way, if you didn't. It was a great one. That, you know, in this day and age, video matters, right? Attention spans are short. And here I am trying to get a message out, trying to talk about things that I care about with the American people. And that means, kind of unfortunately, showing my ugly mug on video somewhat regularly. So I've started doing that. And in this show, I'll actually talk about, I guess, the 2 topics that I briefly broached in the first 2 videos that I published. One being Brexit, which we'll come to later, and one being this 1 year anniversary of my becoming an American. And in that little video, check it out, I actually show a great gift that I was given when I became an American. It was a flag, and it was a flag that flew above the Capitol building as I was taking the oath to become a citizen. And a great friend of mine, Serena, who has supported my work since I kind of started being all political. I met her here in Seattle. She was also a Ron Paul person. That's how I got to know her. We were both supporting Ron Paul in the 2011-12 cycle. She had Rand Paul's office. I don't even know how you'd say it. Give me this flag that had been flying above the Capitol building on the day I became a citizen. And included in the box with the flag was this certificate saying that, when it was flown and why it was flown, and that it was flown in honor of my taking the oath to become a citizen after a 12-year naturalization process. That means a lot to me. The gift, the amazing thought of the gift. I mean, who even knew that was possible? That you could get a United States senator to certify that a flag was flown in your honor. I think that was actually the phrase on the certificate, and then given to you as a private citizen. I should say one of the things I most loved about the citizenship ceremony was the statement that was made in a video that was played to all of us who were becoming citizens on that day. A statement made by the president, obviously then Obama, where he said, "You have now acquired the highest title in the land, the title of citizen." And I thought that was kind of clever. And in a way, it's really what American exceptionalism is all about. Because in an important sense, of course, our president was quite right to say that in America, the highest title is citizen, not president. Coming from a country where we have lords and ladies and dames and earls and barons and all the rest of it, that made me smile. And it probably is the biggest difference in some ways, at least on paper, between the United States and the United Kingdom, where I was born. This rejection of certainly explicit forms of hierarchy. So, 1 year as an American, the time flies. The time really does fly. But the other thing I said I wanted to mention, something that also has happened in the last couple of weeks, and it's so important that I haven't discussed on this show yet, is that the United Kingdom government handed to the European Union a letter initiating what is called the Article 50 process. That is an article in one of the European treaties that governs the leaving of a member of the European Union from the Union. It has been said, I actually heard on the radio, because you can imagine there was a lot of news about this in the UK, that the person who put the clause into the treaty that is called Article 50 kind of put it in there really because it just had to be in there for legal reasons, never thinking that anyone would ever use it. And apparently, I also heard in this radio show that those who did think it might be used and therefore needed to be there were those who thought that a dictator may take over a European country and using his dictatorial powers would want to extract the country from the EU. Never occurred to them, apparently, that a country might want to leave what is actually an entirely oligarchical superstate, precisely because they were asserting their democratic right and their right to self-determination. But that's the kind of arrogance that you expect from the EU. It was a very, very wonderful day for me, March 29th, to know that Britain had finally set itself on the path to extricate itself from the EU. Very exciting. I don't think we will be seeing a life-size bronze statue of Nigel Farage in Parliament Square anytime soon. More's the pity, I say. More's the pity. Because, there are many characters in history that actually are responsible for giving a nation its independence. In America, we know who those people are, and we celebrate them. In fact, a lot of them have their signature on this document under which I record this show, the Declaration of Independence, and so their names are recorded for posterity. Of course, the British media don't treat Nigel Farage with such respect, but I think what he has done for England, history will tell, is obviously hugely important. And whether he carries himself like a statesman, whether he speaks like a statesman, what he has done for the UK is extremely statesman-like. So what an amazing couple of weeks. And as we go into the break here, I should say that the next topic I'm going to talk about is one that made my celebration of becoming an American, my 1-year anniversary celebration, somewhat bittersweet. Because on the day I was marking that commitment to my new country, Donald Trump and his administration authorized the sending of missiles into Syria ostensibly in response to a chemical weapons attack by President Assad on his own people. That was, I believe, day 76 of the new presidency of Donald Trump. One of the things that folks like me who care about liberty and peace were somewhat happy about with Trump's, coming to power, although I didn't feel very comfortable about it. But one thing I was more comfortable about was that he seemed to not be the same kind of interventionist as, well, every president that I know anything about, any president that's been in office since I've been engaged in politics. Apparently Donald Trump called out the massive error that was the Second Iraq War. Some of us were hoping to be able to wait at least for a little bit longer before he started lobbing missiles into the Middle East. We'll talk a little bit about that when we come back. So I went into the break mentioning that the United States is, in a manner of speaking, at war with Syria, but of course not officially, because we don't declare war anymore. We just commit acts of war and call them by other names. Of course, Obama, when he acted in Libya, I think he called it, kinetic military action? The likes of Rand Paul and Justin Amash are pointing out that an act of war needs constitutional authority. There is, of course, the legislation that the executive always refers to, passed in the 70s, that authorize the executive, the president, to act in cases of emergency. But, of course, the question is begged there. Is there an emergency when a president attacks his own people? Now, assuming the information is right, and there's some dispute about that, of course, as there always is. Assuming, though, that President Assad is an evil man, and he probably is, who has just killed some of his citizens with chemical weapons, does that constitute an emergency for the United States? Personally, I don't believe that it can be said to be so. It can't be said to be so because nothing's changed in Syria. One has to wonder what the intent is of folks who would unleash violence in situations like this. The will to punish is entirely understandable. The will to make it clear, whatever that means, that this behavior cannot be allowed to stand is entirely understandable. The question is, though, of course, does this kind of response work? Because if not, it's a response that makes the responders feel better rather than actually saving lives or making lives better. So where lies the moral burden? That's the question, right? Where lies the moral burden? I approach the politics of life and death questions such as intervention in Syria with a thought experiment. I imagine looking in the eyes of the mother of a person who would die if my preferred course of action was carried through, but who would live if an opposing course of action were carried through. I imagine trying to justify to that mother why her son should die for the greater good that I believe my view is rooted in. The approach sets a very high bar for justification of not only the good that will be done and the bad that will be prevented by a particular policy, but also the trustworthiness and accuracy of the knowledge on which one's analysis of a situation is based. It gets one out of one's ideology. Imagining speaking with the mother of a boy caught by the debris produced by an American cruise missile attack in Syria, I'd have to leave her house in shame if I could not confidently tell her that her son's death would be saving myriad lives and explain convincingly the reason for my complete trust in the knowledge on which I based my claim. We should support intervention with no more certainty than our certainty in the accuracy, integrity, and lack of bias of the sources of the information on which it's based, and of the people who would communicate that information to us. And if we have any reason to doubt any one of those things based on recent evidence, we should demand a clear explanation as to why this time the information, the people, and their motivations are better than before. To be worthy of our support, I'd say, those politicians who would blow up anything or anyone in Syria must share their evidence of the guilty parties with us. It must be many times stronger than the evidence we had for Saddam's weapons of mass destruction and mobile anthrax labs, which turned out to be rubbish. Before they can do that, they must rebuild our trust in their sources of information. What evidence do they have of crime and guilt, and how do we know this isn't the Syrian sequel to the Iraq dossier? They must rebuild our trust in their personal integrity so that only the most paranoid American could suspect the manipulation of information for political purposes. They must especially do so in the face of a coherent counter-narrative, such as described by the memo publicized by American General and former NATO Commander Wesley Clark, that revealed a decision made years ago to take down the governments of Iraq, check, Libya, check, Iran, cyber war and economic war already initiated, Somalia, Sudan, and Syria. They must also provide clear worst case and best case assessments of the upside and downside of intervention. And the latter must take into account the fact that most of the consequences of unleashing violence are unpredictable in their specifics, mostly uncontrollable, and full of uncertainties that are almost entirely iatrogenic. Now, you might not have heard that word before, but it means causing harmful outcomes in an attempt to solve a problem or do good. Does any American even know enough about the state next to the one he resides in, a peaceful, wealthy, and lawful democracy, to say with any certainty how to solve its greatest problem? Of course not. So how can we possibly lend our moral weight to a solution to a problem in Syria, a country about which most of us know nothing, and a solution about which all we know is that it involves aggression and outcomes that we cannot determine? And do we really believe our representatives or our president know any more about the place than we do? Even if we assume that the Syrian regime is responsible for the crimes to which the USA would be responding, then the only possible upsides are that the intervention, 1, eliminates the regime, 2, prevents the regime from committing similar crimes again, or 3, prevents some unspecified other regime from doing something bad at an unspecified time in the future. Well, the first isn't being sought, the third is ridiculous, so let's see if we can get a justification for the second. What's the causal thread by which our intervention will save lives? Moreover, what kind of punishment does such action deal out to President Assad and his favourite chemical weapons operators, unless they are all within debris flying distance of one of the cruise missiles that we fling? Why do we think he even cares about what we do if our action is to be limited? What makes us so confident that we won't be tipping the balance in favour of equally awful thugs? And what's the interventionist comeback to the fact that Western interference in the affairs of Arab nations always carries a price, in increased resentment and resistance, and the fact that bringing violence to bear on any country tends to unite it against the bringers of that violence, regardless of their intentions? Too many questions remain unanswered, as usual. In my thought experiment, the Syrian mother would surely ask for evidence that interventions such as the one proposed have had the desired effect in the past. Do we know enough about the intended rules of engagement in this intervention even to begin to answer that? Indeed, what about the most obvious policy question that has not been asked anywhere? Surely the very fact that Assad used chemical weapons against his people is evidence that all our previous attempts to punish tyrants who've overstepped the line don't work. Because if they had, Assad wouldn't have used those weapons, would he? So why will this punitive attack make any difference to the next dictator when our earlier ones made none to Assad? Are we sure we're not just doing all this to make ourselves feel better, either more moral or more capable than the outcomes will eventually reveal us to be? Also, we must be able to answer the mother's inevitable demand for our own moral consistency. She'd ask us why we are acting in Syria, but not in other places where even greater evil has been done, and sometimes using the same weapons. Specifically, why don't we take down North Korea, where chemical weapons, and worse, are used in concentration camps daily to kill political prisoners? Is our answer that North Korea has more powerful allies or a greater ability to hit back? In other words, do we only hit bullies when they're weak enough to hit? That response might be defensible, but a supporter of a strike against Syria can only claim a moral basis if he has at least asked that question and answered it satisfactorily. And if our motivation is truly humanitarian, is there really no other way of responding to the crisis except by action that is both unilateral and violent, the worst of all worlds? Are we seriously being asked to believe that, assuming the evidence of guilt of the Syrian government is beyond reasonable doubt, is it? The USA is the only nation on earth to care enough to do anything about it, and that the only effective response involves blowing up things and people? In other words, can we tell the mother in this thought experiment that there really was no alternative to the death of her son caught in the debris of our missile? We're going into the break, everyone. This is Liberty with Love. I'm Robin Koerner. I'll be sharing some more thoughts on the Syrian intervention when we get back from this break. In 2011, Robin Koerner wrote the article that launched the biggest coalition for Ron Paul's presidential run, called Blue Republican. Now, Stairway Press is pleased to announce the publication of his first book, If You Can Keep It, Why We Nearly Lost It and How We Get It Back. Jeffrey Tucker, who wrote the foreword, says brilliant ideas come in effervescent packages. This is a good description of Robin Koerner's provocative work. It's a work of stunning erudition and sincerity. I also happen to agree with it. I've been struggling toward a similar thesis for a good part of my writing career, though I'm certain Robin has gone beyond even my most mature thought. His section on liberty as a realization of a civilization of love truly sweeps me away with its insight and depth. I know that time is short and that people don't read as carefully as they should, but this section deserves close study by every advocate of liberty. It will change the way you think and speak about the topic. We need this book now. Pre-order your personally signed copy of If You Can Keep It at ifyoucankeepit.us. So when we went into the break, I was asking a question, many questions. The last one I asked was, could we tell the mother in our thought experiment, the mother of the person that died as a result of our interventions, and even if not as a result of this one in our thought experiment, of whatever may come next now that we have opened this can of worms or Pandora's box, can we tell that mother that there really was no alternative to the death of her son who might be caught in the debris of our missile? One already flung or one yet to be flung. Now, the retort that people will also die if we do nothing is usually offered to imply that moral and informational standards for action should be lower for such military interventions than those imposed in a court. But that retort misses almost all of the things I've talked about here in this show. People are dying all over the world as a consequence of myriad actions that we do nothing about. How many will die in Syria if we do nothing? Okay, but how exactly will our intervention stop them from dying? How do we know that the number saved, if any, will exceed the deaths we might cause if and when we have to deal with the spiraling unintended consequences of our intervention? And what about all those other people who are dying in other countries every day because we do nothing? If our foreign policy is essentially humanitarian, why are we not intervening in all those other places too? On the other hand, if our motivation is not humanitarian, but rather a matter of American national interest, then which interest exactly is being served by this intervention? And is it really greater than any other to which we could apply our military today? The truth is our politicians, and specifically our president, approach such questions with an astoundingly unjustified belief in their knowledge and analytical capabilities. And I think this is what I really care most about. It's kind of like the epistemological consequences, the arrogance of these kind of actions. If we are serious about saving lives around the world, let us imagine something else. Let us imagine that there's overwhelming evidence for the guilt of the Assad regime, that somehow we know that we can save many lives by acting and that our actions won't have unintended negative consequences that cancel out the good outcomes many times over. Even if we allow all of that and our newly interventionist president were right, then it would indeed be his responsibility to convince Congress and through them to convince us, the people, to bring us with them. Our leaders, both president and representatives, gave themselves that responsibility when they chose to become our leaders. But to fulfill that responsibility, they have to have our trust. But we, the people, don't trust our executive or our legislature very much, do we? We don't trust them because they say so many things that they contradict by their actions, because they put party or ego before principle, because they swear an oath to uphold a constitution that they immediately undermine, because they make one rule for themselves and one for others, because in the worst case they lie, such as to gain public support for a war of choice, or, marginally better, they are so credulous as to go along with the lies they are fed without demanding evidence proportionate to the consequences of acting on them. And of course, in this long list, I'm not just talking about President Trump. He may not have exhibited all of those things, but we know collectively our leaders, president and representatives, certainly exhibit all of those things. In other words, our so-called leaders have form, and it's not very good form. And just because the failings of our leaders should not prevent us as a nation from acting aggressively when it's morally right to do so, it should also not prevent us from demanding, before any such action, standards of insight, trustworthiness, statesmanship, and consistency that the political class has failed to display for far too long and our president has yet to establish. If our politicians were true humanitarians prepared to risk American lives and treasure for the good of non-Americans, something they should approach us very, very humbly to request, by the way, then they would every day treat their unique position in our society with a reverence and intellectual honesty equal to the unlimited trust that they ask us to place in them in those moments when they seek to exercise the most awesome powers of this country in such a way. I won't be holding my breath, as I rather suspect the unintended consequences of yesterday's intervention will begin much sooner than that. It's so hard, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen, to know what to think when, in our name, missiles get lobbed. And I really hope no innocent person has been killed in the recent intervention, but I am more concerned of, as I said in this monologue here, of the unintended consequences. It's always the unintended consequences. I mean, my God, we've destroyed lives in America from the unintended consequences of perfectly good, benign policies, or seemingly good, benign policies. You know, like giving poor people food stamps. I mean, things like that. We've managed, with the clumsiness of implementation, to actually destroy lives through. I don't know. I just really don't. My heart sank when I heard about the Syria intervention. And it is so hard because I don't want to judge. I am not a pacifist. I really am not a pacifist. You know, I asked Gary Johnson in an interview years ago to respond to his challengers who say he's not really a libertarian, he's not really an adherent to the non-aggression principle, because he would not rule out military interventions in a way that folks like Ron Paul tend to rule them out. And his answer was, look, never say never. He said, I'm not going to give a blanket, statement that would confine him, this is when he was running for president, to never intervening for humanitarian reasons. And I note, by the way, that Bill Clinton, when he was asked what his greatest mistake as president was, said not intervening in Rwanda, as soon as he should. I am prepared to believe entirely that a lot of these men in power do what they do. They cause violence for good reason. And, following Johnson, I can see that there are times when violence may be an appropriate reaction. I'm not a pacifist. I get that. But, times that are so terrible that violence is justified, then, they're exactly the things that you can take to the people. You do have this responsibility as a politician. Bring them with you. If things are that awful, the Americans are good people. They can be persuaded. At the very least, the bar to lobbing missiles at foreigners should be that you have persuaded your people, especially when we have the constitution that we have that makes the declaration of war or the initiating of acts of war a matter for the representatives of the people. The problem is here, I suppose, that we've kind of normalized a completely different set of standards for justifying a decision to do violence. The argument shouldn't be simply about whether the violence is justified based on the information the person unleashing it is giving us. Absolutely not. That's not the issue. The issue is whether that decision-making process is up to the task, can ever justify that kind of consequence, that kind of use of it. That's the issue. We have to hold ourselves to higher standards. We have to deploy the most stringent political standards and decision-making processes when the consequences are so great. And again, the consequences are not just the cost of 50 missiles and a partially blown up runway in a foreign country. It never stops there. There's always the unknowns, right? Like now, obviously, is the impact on other, relationships with other countries. The media are talking a lot about the relationship between the US and Russia. Now, it may well be that, for all I know, the whole thing was done in collaboration with the Russians. I mean, we don't know. We're not privy to the conversations. We're not behind the closed doors where the decisions are made. One thing I talk a lot about in the first chapter of my book, if you can keep it, is that we always know a lot less than we believe we know when it comes to political actions in complex contexts. The media always have very limited data, and they try and kind of draw a line through that limited data. They make a narrative out of a few data points, and it's invariably wrong. Invariably massively wrong, actually. So we need to be very skeptical. But it's from that place of skepticism that I suggest we hold ourselves and our leaders to higher standards. We've got to require them to justify themselves to us. That's what I'm concerned about. Okay. Enough of that. Let's go back to the happier topic that I started this show with. Brexit and the beginning of the end of Britain in the European Union. Some people are hoping that it's actually the beginning of the end of the European Union, although that might be a bit too much to wish for. When the letter was delivered by the British government, or by the representative of the British government to the EU, it was received by Donald Tusk, a former Polish prime minister who chairs meetings of EU leaders. And he responded that there was no reason, he said, to pretend that it's a happy day, either in Brussels or London. And, I was kind of floored by that a little bit. There was huge reason to believe it was a happy day in London. And that should have been obvious from the fact that the majority of British voters voted to leave. So the majority of British voters got exactly what they want. Now, why would Mr. Tusk, the European, I don't even want to call him leader, the European Council president, to give him his proper title for what it's worth, why would he think that we wouldn't have been happy to get what we want? Why would he think, as he said, that the negotiations were all going to be about damage control, right? That there was no upside. He said it's about damage control on both sides. No, Mr. Tusk. That attitude that we can't do without the EU, that being out is so much worse than being in, that we are somehow deficient, lacking to choose our freedom, our ability to self-determine, to make rules that govern ourselves through people who we can get rid of when they do a bad job, unlike in the EU. All of those things are why we're much happier to be out than to be in. That's not about damage control. Coming out of the EU, it's not about limiting the downside. It's about finally getting the upside that we've stopped ourselves from getting for years and years as members of the EU, upsides of liberty, of democracy, of all of the things that we've given up to participate in this anti-democratic monstrosity that is the EUSSR. European Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as it came to be. I think there may be quite a bit of damage control, of course, on the European side, and because they've now lost their second biggest donor. Think about that. The second biggest donor to an organization of 28 countries is now leaving for good reason. They've got a big hole to plug. And in another example of the kind of attitudes that the British voted to leave, in the response that was given to the British letter initiating withdrawal was a clause about how the Spanish will be able to veto any agreement that is made between the EU and Britain if they do not like its application to Gibraltar. Now, Gibraltar is a couple of square miles on the south tip of Spain that was legally ceded to the British in the Treaty of Utrecht more than 300 years ago. It's been British ever since. The people who live there are British. It's a British population. Whenever they're asked in referendums if they want to remain British, they say yes, like 96% or something. It's a British... it's actually technically a British overseas territory, and it's self-governing. Now, the Spanish and the European Union and the British all sign up to clauses on self-determination when it comes to their membership of the EU and their membership of the United Nations. But oh no, just to rub it into the faces of the Brits who are leaving, the Spanish specially put into that letter that they will get to veto the deal if they don't like the fact that it applies to Gibraltar. Now, obviously, there's nothing actually legally of any legal substance here because all of the countries in the European Union technically have a veto over whatever deal the European Union comes to with the British, right? We've got 2 years to sort out this divorce deal. But the fact that they put it in that letter in that way, that the Spanish, as it were, wrote it up in a way that asserted their right over Gibraltar, is just exactly the kind of kick in the teeth, the kind of attitude that disrespects the democratic will of, in this case, the people of Gibraltar. Exactly that attitude that the British voted to leave. And there it is again. It's like they can't stop themselves, these Eurocrats, these anti-democratic Eurocrats. Well, at least the Brits have stopped them in Britain. So, my friends, thanks for being with me on this show. I guess we've discussed two really huge topics, both of which will have unintended consequences. I am obviously a lot more sanguine about one than the other. We shall see. Check out the archives of Liberty with Love with Robin Koerner on libertytalk.fm if you've missed any of my shows. I'm putting out pretty much new content now every week on for this show. So there's some great shows in the on-demand section of libertytalk.fm. If you're on YouTube, of course, you can also find the YouTube versions of the shows. And also, if you're on YouTube, if you don't want to listen to a 45-minute audio, perhaps you don't mind seeing 4 or 5 minutes of my ugly mug on a video. So please do subscribe to my channel, Robin Koerner, Art of Political Persuasion. Just do a search on YouTube and you will find that. If you still haven't picked up a copy of my book, go to ifyoucankeepit.us. Ifyoucankeepit.us. I am still sending off signed copies of that book for people who order a copy on that site. And, you know, if you've bought the book and if you have enjoyed it, or even if you haven't, I hesitate to even allow that possibility, I would be so grateful if you would maybe just go over to Amazon and leave a review. It's useful to me as a writer to know what's resonated with people, what they've liked, what they haven't. So I would really appreciate that. And of course, any review on Amazon certainly helps with sales. So that's fantastic. And last but not least, I will be on a panel discussing the state of education in the United States at Renton Library on the 20th of April, Renton being a town nearby Seattle where I live. So I'm looking forward to having that discussion in front of a bunch of high school students. So it's going to be great to get their participation. I'll be especially considering the potential up and downsides of standardizing tests and curriculums. This is obviously an increasingly important issue since the advocacy by many of Common Core. So if you're interested in that, go to robinkoerner.com and you can see my schedule. And maybe you can come and join us for that event at Renton Library. All right. See you next week, my friends. This is Liberty with Love with Robin Koerner.
Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
If you appreciated this episode of Liberty with Love with Robin Koerner, then please go ahead and like it, subscribe to my channel, and maybe check out one of the other episodes like this one here.